Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone. So I'm really pleased to have you on the show, Sofia. Welcome to The No Show. Firstly, let me know, how have you been dealing with lockdown since you've spent most of the time in your native Mexico?
Thank you very much for having me in the show. I'm very pleased to be here and talk about my research and things. So about the lockdown, it has been challenging, but at the beginning of the lockdown, I decided to go to my home country to be with my parents. So my husband and I, we flew to Mexico and we stayed there it was originally going to be 1 month, but at the end, we stayed for 4 because we were stranded there, so we couldn't come back. And now I am happy to come back to the UK.
And how did you manage to sort of continue your research and your teaching from over there?
So luckily, the type of research that I do is mainly a survey. So it's survey based, and also I do a lot of things, like I do research and I can do it from home. So luckily, the lockdown started when we started the research period.
Okay.
So that was relatively easy. So it was only a couple of days when we had to teach online remotely, which was fun actually. Like I had to wake up very early to be on the screen at the same time that my students were in the UK. So that was fun.
Yeah.
And then we just started to do research, and I can do research just from home because I have access to my books, the survey. We launched a survey during that period to local councillors, but it was mainly an online survey, so it worked fine.
And in this period, am I right in saying is it in this period that you wrote an article for the Conversation about the sort of the people's, or the difference between the worry of men and women about the spread of coronavirus?
Yeah, that was part of our project. It's called the Pandemic Politics Project. And we ran a survey of, like a representative survey among the UK population. And well, when we analyzed the survey, we realized that research indicates that women are less likely to die from COVID-19 than men. However, we wanted to know exactly how the pandemic is affecting women. And one of the things that we realized is that, and this comes on the conversation piece that I wrote, is that even though women are not more likely to contract the virus, they are more worried about it. And there are many reasons why they are more worried about it. First is because of the consequences of COVID that may have on economics, but also the social dimensions of it. So women are more likely to know people that are sick, but also to have caring responsibilities for them, which actually make the whole issue more worrying for them, because they are going to be with more, like with increased contact, which puts them in risk. But as well, there is the juggling about all responsibilities that they have at home, professional, homeschooling for many of them, and that just increased the stress levels. So as I mentioned before, it's not like they are more likely to contract the virus, but because they are most exposed to the social and economic consequences of the pandemic, they worry more. And
it sounds like, it sounds kind of complex, because on the one hand, you have women having all these social responsibilities and caring responsibilities. Is the worry that they have, is that because of these sort of caring responsibilities that they might contract the disease, or is it just the stress of having to take on all these additional tasks?
Well, it's difficult to know because everything comes from a feeling, right? And trying to disentangle feelings is very complicated. And the survey was not necessarily designed to do that from the original, like from the start, from the design stage. I will say that is because everything adds to each other. So the fact that you know more people, it's like a networking effect. For example, if I know somebody who is sick and I see the consequences of being sick, immediately I worry more because I might get sick, right?
Yeah.
It's the same that it's the same form that we use, for example, when we try to look at fears of crime, which is another paper that I wrote 2 years ago, I think. When we realize that when people talk to each other, it's not about your personal experiences, but the experiences of the people that are close to you. So if the people that are close to you are getting sick, it's more likely to be that you will be worried about becoming sick. But also, if you see how difficult it is for people with caring responsibilities to be to actually perform and to do everything at the same time, then of course you will be worried about being on the same situation. So it's about being exposed, but it's also I would say it's three-dimensional. It's about your network being exposed, the fact that they are exposed to the disease themselves, but also the fact that they have additional burden at home and to cope with everything.
Yeah.
So all of it adds together to make them more stressed about the context. But also, I would have to say that in the future we might see that women are more affected psychologically by the pandemic than men. But this also because they have been more stressed about it.
And I mean, what are the sort of political undertones to women being a lot more socially connected? Is there sort of an idea as to why that might be?
Well, there are many ideas, like one or many possible explanations for it. But one of it relates to the fact that a lot of care workers are actually women. So that increases exposure. And the other thing is that traditionally women have wider networks than men, just because they stay at home. Even for the women that stay at home, they go and they care for the children. They engage with schools. So we know already that they belong to a wider network than men who might be slightly less, perhaps sociable, maybe. I don't know. I mean, it's difficult to say because we are talking about averages and statistics. So I will not say that every man or women face those differences, but it's something that we are observing on average.
I mean, but it does make complete sense because, I mean, especially from a social care perspective, because, I mean, typically nurses, women to men ratio is significantly like weighted towards the women. But one of the things that comes to my mind is from a professional standpoint, like sort of jobs that office jobs or jobs in the city and that sort of stuff. You'd think traditionally men play a larger role in that because of just how inequality and things unfolded over the past sort of 60, 70 years. So isn't that counterintuitive that men don't have as wide a network, given that they've been in sort of this environment longer?
Yeah, but the networks are professional, right? So it's extremely unlikely that if you are embedded in a professional network, that you will care. I mean, we care in the sense of it's sad if somebody that is close to us becomes sick, but men don't have the same caring responsibilities as women. So it's not only about being embedded in professional networks, it's also about the social networks that we have. As I mentioned before, like if you have old parents, for this very reason that you mentioned before, like because of inequality and the structures of power that we are embedded in, women are more likely to care for the elderly, for example, or people with some disabilities, which put them on the front line.
And I mean, your research in general is quite diverse, given that you've also looked at things, you've also looked at the idea of sort of political intimidation. So before I get into that, I want to know sort of what was your background going into research? How did you sort of approach your sort of research career?
So before I started at Royal Holloway, I was a public policy consultant in my home country, which is Mexico, for a long time. And then I came to the UK originally to do my PhD, and my PhD was in decentralization and the political drivers behind structural reforms. And from there, because I was looking at decentralization and how things differ between regions, then I became quite interested in regional differences. So it's long. And I got when I finished my PhD, I did a postdoc in the University of Strathclyde that was mainly on public opinion.
Okay.
So, and I got involved in the candidate survey. So it's a large survey that we did among all candidates standing in the 2017 and 2015 general election. And now we're fielding 2019. So because I got involved in this large survey, we started to look at the behaviors of candidates, how they campaign, what they were experiences and motivations. So as I said, it started because I was interested in regional and country differences, and then that led to this type of research. So when I was looking at that, there started to be a lot of anecdotal reports in the newspapers about men and women in politics being harassed and being subject of increasing abuse. So I got interested in the topic, and I thought this is something interesting because as Mexican, we are more used to this type of discussions, like electoral related violence, for example, in the country, because we know that the country already faces some security problems. So we are kind of aware that things are happening and that during elections, candidates might be at risk. Mm-hmm. But I thought, and Wolfgang Grudig in the Strathclyde, I thought it was interesting that this type of claims were actually being made about a country that is otherwise peaceful like the UK. So the survey team, Wolfgang Grudig and other co-investigators, they took, so we started to discuss this issue, and we adapted a battery of questions about harassment and intimidation that were used before, but just only among MPs. And we iterated to the context, to the UK context, and to be applied to candidates. So then we start asking them, okay, have you been subject of harassment and intimidation, and which type of actions they suffer the most? That was actually interesting, because at the beginning we thought we were going to be getting, the aim was to know how widespread the problem was from the beginning. Again, instead of having just anecdotal evidence, to start systematizing what we know to see if this is really a widespread problem or it's not. And we were really surprised once we started analyzing the data to realize that about 1 in every 2 women are subject of harassment, and that 38% of the overall bunch of candidates, of the total of candidates, affirmed to have suffered some form of harassment or intimidation while they were campaigning in 2017. Mm-hmm. So that was, in my view, quite surprising. As I mentioned before, I know, or there is a lot of research on electoral-related violence applied to countries that are of recent transition to democracy or that have other type of conflict in the country. Mm-hmm. So it was surprising to find that in the UK. Of course, we know that the type of harassment and intimidation that they suffer might be different from what is being faced by candidates in other countries. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't have an effect. So, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't make the campaigning experience very unpleasant. So, for example, we asked them as well about the emotional response that they suffer from it. And it was surprising to find that a large proportion of them were fearful when they were campaigning, which I think in a country which is, a long-established democracy, one of the strongest in the world, one of the oldest in the world as well, and that do not suffer any other conflict, it's interesting to observe why people, or to identify why people in politics are being subject of violence and abuse.
And you mentioned that 38% of, was it women that said that they were intimidated Or in general?
Overall, the overall proportion among men and women is 38%.
Okay, and so how did you define harassment in that context?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and it's subject of a lot of discussion. There is a lot of research that many times when you ask about harassment, we have to leave the question open. Have you been subject of harassment and intimidation or any aggressive behavior towards you when you were campaigning? That was how we framed the question. And the reason why we leave it open is because what really is an aggression depends person to person. So, for example, it depends on how much the individual has normalized other types of violence, other experiences in your life, but also what I consider to be aggressive or make me feel fearful. And the reason why we leave it open is because there is also a lot of research that has shown that people act based on their feelings and not necessarily on the objective threat. So let's say I walk on the street and the street is empty, right? If people ask me about my feelings of security, if the street is empty and dark, I will respond that I feel very insecure, right? However, objectively, I am not insecure. If the street is empty, it's very unlikely that somebody will mock me or do something wrong to me. But I feel the threat. So if I have to walk every day to home, crossing the same empty and dark street, my feelings of security will be diminished. But it doesn't mean that the threat is real. So we know that what really affects the quality of life and the quality of the experience is how people feel about it, not necessarily how objectively threatened they are. So that's the reason why we leave it open.
So when, okay, I understand you leave it open, but is the word harassment rooted in fear of sort of personal harm, or is it just any kind of irrational fear?
No, so it's not the only question that we ask them. We ask them first if they have been subject of harassment or intimidation, leaving them open the door to self-define what they consider to be harassment and intimidation. However, we later ask them how safe or unsafe they felt during the campaign. And we realize as well that if we ask men and women in general about harassment, they might answer no, but just because they have normalized certain types of violence and they do not consider those actions really to be threatening. So, for example, for a lot of them, they don't consider harassment on social media to be defined under the term harassment, right? Or to be included in the term harassment. What for example, they will understand at the beginning by harassment, just like these physical actions. So we later on show them a list of possible behaviors that they might have encountered. So, for example, people following them on the streets, intimidation or threats on social media, people sending them letters. And we found a very interesting reaction there. Like, of course, harassment on social media is more often experienced than face-to-face harassment or physical harassment. But there are many cases when they think like, this is not normal and this should not be part of the political environment. And I am being subject to this type of behavior and by talking about their experiences, they can also recognize that it's not normal and it should not be happening, but also to have a more concrete discussion about what we can do to make politics a safer environment for us all. So I follow this. So this was a large survey. It was applied to, as I mentioned, to candidates standing in parliamentary elections. But then with the help of the British Academy and Leverhulme Small Grants, I applied another survey to local councillors in England.
Okay.
To see the differences between what we observe at the national level and what might be happening at the local level. And I follow the survey with some interviews. And that was really fascinating. I mean, fascinating might not be the word, because how do you say fascinating about something that is actually tragic?
But I mean, I suppose the findings are, though.
Yeah, exactly. So from a researcher's point of view, actually it's very interesting. So we found that the patterns are followed at the local level. So again, about 38% of local councillors said that they have been victims of harassment. And when I interview them, I think it is, so some very interesting things come up. For example, the fact that harassment is strongly linked to the position that they have. So, for example, if they belong to a committee that is going to make an important decision or that has a lot of power, then sometimes they are object of harassment to prevent them from making the decisions or to actually force them to resign from the committee. So that's a way to actually meddling in politics and affect policy decisions that I find is worrisome, because it means that representatives need to feel free and safe to make the best decisions. And this type of actions or being threatened actually affects the quality of democracy in the country.
But I mean, isn't that part of the fabric of the democracy in the country and in any democracy? I mean, in the US or here, because obviously on one hand you have the lobbyists who promise money to MPs and councillors and what have you. But then I'm sure there's the opposite side to that, where you want to sort of repel somebody from doing something that is in your best interest. So isn't that just part of the fabric of democracy?
Well, that's interesting, because for some people, when we asked in the survey, some of the people say that representatives need to get used to it. There is a certain amount of aggression in politics that is just part of the game. However, we have to recognize that this type of actions prevent some people from participating in politics. So if by definition and philosophy, we want the best people to be representing us, we need to level the ground and actually tell them, it's safe to represent me because they are doing a public, like something that is a public good there. So we have to tell them, yes, of course, there are many other things that will affect how they make decisions, like lobby companies and so on. Or even, personal knowledge and the previous careers that might affect how they make a decision. However, by feeling afraid, it means that we cannot really calculate the cost benefits of one particular decision, but also by preventing them from participating, we might not get the best people to represent us, but just the bravest.
Mm-hmm.
And we know already that there are some underrepresented groups that might feel more vulnerable for any other reason, right? Like women, minorities, some people with disabilities. They are already underrepresented. If we don't make the environment safe for them to participate, then we might have even more problems to get them to participate in politics. And I think that's a problem.
Absolutely. I mean, this is really, really interesting to sort of hear that it happening on the council on a council level, which is like very, very sort of local. And it's not something that you'd hear, but how much of an impact did sort of a major incident like the killing of Joe Cox affect the mindsets of MPs and members of people working in government?
So, unfortunately, Joe Cox murder had a huge impact in many aspects, but one of them is that people became more aware of the problem, and a lot of MPs started to talk about that, which is, I think it's something good, right? Like, we are hearing more and more claims about, and the discussion about harassment and intimidation is more widespread now. So we, of course, might be observing an increase on it that is just related to the fact that they are more aware of this now than they were before. Mm-hmm. But also it highlighted the problem. And the problem is that there are very few instruments that candidates and representatives have to actually protect themselves. So because of Joe Cox murder, then there was a lot of investigations, people started to talk about it, there was more awareness about it, but also the instruments to protect representatives were strengthened. So at the beginning, it was a problem that we observed only among MPs. So MPs got access to certain instruments and provisions to help them. So for example, the police, the signed police to help them, the fact that they can file claims, which is something that is interesting, is sometimes it's not the representative that has to file the claim because they don't receive the threat themselves. So sometimes it's people in their offices that actually receive the threat, or that read it or answer the call, the phone when the threat is being delivered. So it's not only affecting the MP or the representative, but also the team of people that work with them. And in the local level, I think it's the same. So one of the things that came very often in the survey is that local councillors were mentioning that once they have been victims of harassment or intimidation, they sometimes try to report it. So they report it to the police, they report it to the party, and sometimes that's following, there is a follow-up, but sometimes it doesn't. And they say that because they are local representatives, then they don't have access to the same level of protection or the same forum to talk about these experiences that MPs, for example, will have access to. And I think that's important because many people start their careers, many people start their political careers at the local level. And that's one of the reasons why we need to observe what is going on at the local level. So how safe or unsafe they feel when performing their duties. Because that might put off some people from continuing in a political career if it gets too bad. But they came with, so in the interviews, they came with very interesting experiences. So for example, some of them were mentioning that they belong to a community, and sometimes it is more like an orchestrated threat, so, or an orchestrated campaign. So the campaign comes on social media, and then something happens that is real life, and then something approach them in the street, and then so it accumulates until they decide this is too much because I am putting myself and my family in risk.
So I guess I guess there are goals to be met from these threats in general. But I don't know if you asked them this or if you've sort of observed this yourself. But how much has sort of the populism and, the polarized politics impacted the level of intimidation amongst MPs and councillors?
So we asked them about their own positions, their own positions on key issues. So for example, how we tell them that in a scale from 0 to 10, when 0 is left and 10 is right, where do they position themselves?
Okay.
They have to self-select. We also ask them in a position where 0 means in favor of the European, more integration to the European Union, and 10 means Brexit, like a hard Brexit, where do they locate themselves? And then this is interesting because the same questions are being asked by the BES, the British Election Study, among the population. So what we did is, or I took the answers from the BES questions and contrast them against the positions of the MP. Originally, I thought that the difference between the MP self-positioning and the BES answers, so the distance between the representative and the public in the constituency, will actually be driving more harassment. But one of the things that I realized later on when I was trying to test this theory or this hypothesis is that it's not true. It doesn't hold true. It's not about how extreme the constituency is, or how or the difference between the representative and the people. It's actually about the views of the MP or the candidate, the views of the candidate that drive harassment, which I am not trying to say that they are basically earning it or anything like that. It's more like we are, or one of the things that I find, for example, interesting is that when women are more extreme, they are very much more likely than men to be subject of harassment. And this is because there is a penalization about saying something that is not the conventional wisdom. So people that come closer or moderate themselves, they have less reasons to angry other people. And people that are more extreme, they get more harassed because they get more visibility, that's one thing, but also because their views are not conventional.
Okay, that explains a lot. I mean,
from both sides.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I mean, it explains a lot because you have people on both sides that would say thing. I mean, especially given that politics right now is, it depends so much on how popular you are and how much of a sort of how much noise you're able to make and in the news or on social media. And so one of the things that comes to my mind is that as a result of this, do you think that society ultimately polices the way in which politicians and councillors conduct themselves in public office?
Yes, I mean, I think that's an interesting question, and I should reflect a little bit more on it. I wouldn't say it's a way of policing them to try to moderate, because the reality is that I don't think that violence solved anything or harassment solved anything. But I think there is this temptation when we find people that think completely different from us to disrespect their thoughts. And this is not convincing. It doesn't help to have any healthy political discussion. It just means that we are screaming to each other, and that the person that screamed the loudest will get the last thing to say. But I don't think that actually will help to moderate. On the contrary, I think it will just drive to more extremism and extreme points of view being out there.
So, I mean, in your mind, as a sort of as both somebody who worked in this in the field of politics and public sort of policy and opinion, and as an academic now, do you feel like there's room for sort of, well, I mean, there's ways in which we can fix our political system or our democracy, in that you're able to get the best results or the results that reflect the constituents?
Yes, I mean, I think that representatives have a huge responsibility about it. That's one of the things. If we realize that people that are representing more views that are more on the extreme side, and that they are getting more harassed, it's because they are sparkling more outrage among the population, they get more visibility and so on. But it also indicates that the discourse used by political elites have an effect on how people behave and how they discuss politics. So they do have a huge responsibility to behave and to actually moderate their language when they talk. Perhaps not their views, right? Like, we cannot change their views in many issues. And I mean, there is always going to be people that are more mainstream and people that are more extreme. But it's true that they have to take more care about the way that they talk to each other, because they set the tone in politics and they are the people that get the forum to speak. So people, for example, I don't know, like the media do not cover how people on the ground are talking about politics, but they do cover how representatives talk to each other. And if the public see that this is the tone that they use with each other, then we cannot expect them to be respectful when they discuss politics either. So I think political elites do have a key role in moderating themselves, and that will actually translate into a more moderate discussion among the population in general. So I think there is a way of making politics kinder for everybody, and one way is to have like a better code of conduct among representatives.
But I mean, isn't that sort of a bit of a catch-22 right now? Because there's a fine line between politics and entertainment now, and it seems like, you know, the more entertaining you are, but for example, Boris Johnson, for the longest time in the media, before he became prime minister, and even after he became prime minister, the media almost drew this caricature of Boris Johnson's like, oh, it's Boris being Boris, you know, like he's our entertainer, he says these things, but he's just Boris. So given that there's this sort of element of entertainment, do you think that it's possible for us to ever have a sensible conversation in politics anymore?
Well, the media, is true that the media has a huge responsibility on this. If they keep on covering people and just I'm not sure how to say it, but if they keep on covering people and giving people the forum when they are being outrageous and not holding them accountable for their actions, I think that's a problem. And definitely, if they are going to cover, think about Donald Trump, for example, how he won visibility at the beginning just by saying outrageous things. If I keep on saying things that are outrageous and are actually shocking, and the media keep on covering me, that will resonate among some. That will elevate my popularity because, I mean, it's a well-known fact that it's worse when people don't talk about you than when they talk about you, right? Like, good or bad, at the end, it's going to be people will know your name. And that's what they want. They want to build visibility. They want people to talk about them. And even though they know that they will not be able to convince someone who is not close to their views, so it will be very unlikely that somebody that does not belong to the party will be voting for them. But they also play into party loyalties. So they know who their core base is. And if this core base is do not hold them responsible for their actions and do not demand them to moderate, it will be extremely unlikely that they will do it themselves. So the media has a responsibility when they cover these actions to be, I will say, unbiased, but we know that actually, I mean, every editorial team has it online, and that's fine. But the fact that we are watching TV on demand, that we are watching the news on demand, that we only hear points of view that are close to ours, that helps to polarize the public. So, yeah, I think there is conflicting incentives there. On the one hand, media want to sell. On the other hand, the politicians want to be in everybody's mouth, so they want to be talked about. And there is little debate about what they have to say and holding them accountable for their actions, which is something that should improve.
You mentioned at the beginning of sort of this segment that, you know, it's expected or it's less outrageous or less shocking for us to see political violence and political intimidation in places that have had, you know, or recent democracies or places that have had like violent ruptures and that sort of stuff. How much of that is still, you know, part of that world? Like, is it still very normalized to have political violence in places in Latin America and in the Middle East, etc.? Is that still acceptable?
Well, I will not use the word acceptable because that means that we have just said, okay, fine, this is how things are. I will say that that type of violence just reflects violence that is lived in, happens in the country in other dimensions. So, for example, in the case of Mexico, which is after the UK, the case that I know the best, it's not that people accept that politics will be violent, but it's because there is another type of problem. So the problem with a structural violence in the country, violence that is related to other type of things like narco traffic, drug dealing, or these type of things, that we kind of think, okay, electoral related violence is just a manifestation of other types of violence in the country. So we know that there is a structure, like a structural violence that needs to be solved and tackled. And that by tackling that, we will be able to better address electoral related violence. Which is, I think, on a way, it is not normalizing violence, but on a way is more like saying there is other things that need to be done together, right? So we recognize that there is a problem there, and researchers have for longer tried to study this type of violence because it, as I say, it reflects a structural problem in the country. So it has been part, for example, in Mexico from Mexico is a country of recent transition to democracy. So during elections, it has been part of the discussion for a very long time. How do we make elections safe for everybody to participate? But it's because we know already that something needs to be done. But in the case of the UK, it was, of course, like in the 90s, it was part of the discussion. But then it just failed. Like, it was a manifestation of one particular problem, the troubles in the 90s. And then people started to think that it was not anymore the case. So on a way, Joe Cox, I mean, the sad murder of Joe Cox, just put the discussion again on the table and saying, like, this is going on. It's not like we face in the country violence of any other type very often, but why then we are observing violence in politics?
Mm-hmm. And I mean, obviously, there's sort of a complete contrast between the UK and somewhere like Mexico. But then when you look at Mexico in the context of sort of Latin America, is it just going through what many other countries in the region are going through as well? Much like how the UK is going through what much of Europe is going through.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is countries in Latin America that are observing a rise in populism. And yes, it's true that as it is the case in the UK, if political elites are not careful about the way that they talk about issues, and they keep on polarizing people because they are sparking hate or intolerance, so many times it's not even hate, it's just not respecting other people's views and having very adamant views of what is right and what is wrong in the country. And sometimes what they consider it to be right actually constrains the rights of other people. So I will say that Mexico and other Latin American countries are observing a rise in populism. And the rise in populism reflects on intolerance and polarization among people. And this is a different type of problem, right? Because that means that people cannot talk about politics safely, that the discussion becomes more about feelings and less about facts. But it's different from type of violence that prevent, for example, legislators from making the right decision, or that threaten them or try to influence public policy, or try to prevent certain people from participating in politics. Because one thing is to have a very heated discussion, which is, I mean, as I said, like, we should improve the quality of the discussion in general. But another thing is to say, I'm going to use violent means to prevent your view from being represented, I think.
So let me go back to sort of your sort of career as in as a practitioner of sort of the work you're doing now in public policy. What was the driver behind that? What made you go into public policy? Is it something that you've always been into?
No. So I did my undergrad in international relations. And I think I was very much interested in the cool side of politics, like more into the philosophical aspects of it. So, and that was, I think, very interesting for me. But then when I was finishing, I was looking for a job, as any other undergraduate does. And my first job was in a consultancy that was mainly focused on local level politics and evaluating the quality of life and measuring poverty at the local level. And then I thought, this is a new area. This is interesting. Instead of looking at the, like the macro level of things, I'm not looking at the first line, people that work on the first line. I'm more like in touch with the people, and where actually I thought that was a moment or an area where things matter and when you can actually make the difference. So my first job was to actually implement a survey of quality of services in the municipality where I was living at the time. So I had to go to many other places, and I had a team of 10 people working with me, and they went to do the surveys. And then when I was analyzing the surveys, I thought, I didn't know that even in my city, these type of people, have access to this type of services, or they do not evaluate these services on the same. They don't have the same quality of services that I have.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, that's actually pretty cool. And that's when I got interested more into the public policy area of political science.
And sort of from there, you sort of you mentioned you worked there for quite a while.
Yeah. So I did that for 5 years. So as part of different consultancy projects, we evaluated, for example, some decentralization grants. We look a lot at variations between not only municipalities, but also state variations. So different, again, like in Mexico, because it's a federal country, different states have different government capacities. And looking at that was really enriching. Just to look at how professionalized, for example, representatives are in some states and how they are not in some others, but also how economic development manifests itself in different ways, how they were able to provide access to public services, even in contexts where we thought like, this is interesting, how they are doing very creative policies, for example, to tackle inequality between women and men, or to alleviate poverty. So that was actually a very interesting part of my life. Like, it was 5 years and I really, really enjoy it. And sometimes, it was really cool.
So I want to ask, would you ever consider going into politics after you've seen how people get intimidated and harassed?
Well, I do encourage all my friends to go in politics, and because I'm a lecturer in political communication, I always tell them that, I will design your campaign, but I don't think I will be a candidate. I think I like to. I'm good at evaluating things, and I am really good at looking at things and identifying areas of opportunities and challenges. But I'm kind of very curious, so I like to skip from one problem to the other problem and just look at different diagnoses and create solutions. But I think it requires a different type of qualities to be a representative. Among them, like being good at like discussing things and
basically a salesperson. You have to be a very good salesperson. So. Well, the research. Your research seems very, very diverse, but at the same time, very, very extensive within each area that you get into. Because this is a really, the reason why I was attracted to the work to start with, because it's something that I'd never considered before in the UK when it comes to sort of political intimidation and that sort of thing. But also because, I thought to myself, just a personal opinion, which is like reflecting on it now is wrong. But at the beginning, I was thinking, who cares? Some politicians were getting some slack from members of the public. Who cares? But obviously, you've shed light on the fact that this, alters the conversation of politics and democracy as a whole. And so now that you've done this work, what kind of work would you like to get into the future, or would you like to add to this work?
So right now my work relates to evaluating how widespread the problem is, right? So in a way, it's an evaluation. So we know already which type of experiences representatives are suffering, how do that affect their performance, and in the future, there are two things I would like to do. So first is to analyze what consequences harassment and intimidation have for the career of politicians. Do they decide to drop out from politics? Do they decide to stay in? Does it have an effect when they bring them together to speak about the abuse and that actually move things forward for them and just give them another reason to continue? Or when it gets too scary and they decide to drop out from politics and do something else completely? And the other area where I would like to take my research is through evaluation. For example, politicians under extreme stress make different decisions or do not make these decisions. Okay. So how actually harassment might be affecting really representation. So substantive representation in terms of the type of decisions that they make, and descriptive representation in terms of who stays in politics despite of the abuse.
Okay, so that's really interesting. Looking at sort of the longevity of a politician's career in light of intimidation and harassment. And so, are you part of, at the moment, a research center or institute within the college?
Yes, I am part of the new political communication. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's the bell. Working from home. So at the moment, I am part of the new political communication unit in Royal Holloway.
Yeah.
We do research about political communication and how like campaigns, mainly campaigns, social media, etc. And I am also part of the Elections and Democracy Center, which is focuses on elections in the UK and comparatively, but also the quality of elections, candidates, and so on. So that's my two research centers that I belong to at the moment. And also they are about to start a gender and politics center.
Okay.
I'm going to be part of it.
Oh, excellent. And so where can people find you online or reach you?
So my email is sofia.collignon @RUHL. So
RHUL.
Yeah, Holloway.
Yeah.
.ac.
I'll link all of it anyway, so they'll get direct access to it.
Yeah, great. Yeah, through my page.
And are you on Twitter by any chance?
Yes, I am. Sofia Colmar.
Yeah, I'll link that as well, just so that they can sort of click on it straight away.
I mean, the thing is, like Mexicans, we have two last names, so I am Collignon.
Yeah.
And sometimes my name gets confused.
No, we'll make sure we got the right link. And so, just finally, what bit of advice would you give to anyone looking to get into, whether it's public policy consulting or whether it's just politics as a researcher?
So I am a quantitative researcher. So in general, I do quantitative political science. And I mean, I really love it. I complement my research with interviews and other qualitative methodologies, but I am mainly a quantitative researcher. So one of the key things that I will say is get used to using data.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people, when they started studying politics, they don't like it. And a lot of people, they don't study maths for the A levels and they think it's not important. But one key advice I will say is don't be scared of numbers.
Yeah.
If we can measure things, we can fix them.
Absolutely.
So that's one of the things. And for people interested in public policy, I will say, I mean, there are many different ways of helping society, which I think everybody who wants to study politics in general feels like. There are many ways of helping society, and I will say explore the consultancy area and different consultancies doing things. I mean, a good thing about consultancy is the problems I identified. There are many consultancies and those, for example, already established in solving or tackling one particular challenge of the country. So I will say identify the challenge that you feel passionate about, and reach them.
And I'll just add, stay away from Cambridge Analytica and those kind of companies. Sofia, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. I really enjoyed it, and I hope to have you on the show sometime soon.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. It was really, really nice.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram @TheNoShowPod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone.